Hey everyone, tonight we're diving deep into one of the most visually striking and dangerously seductive Sith Lords in Star Wars history. We're talking about Darth Talon, the crimson-skinned Twelk, whose body became a living canvas of dark side mastery, where every tattoo told a story of conquest, every mark represented a life taken, and every symbol carved into her flesh brought her closer to becoming the ultimate weapon of the One Sith. Before we begin this incredible journey through the Legacy era, make sure to hit that like button if you're ready to explore the transformation of an innocent Twi'lek child into one of Darth Krayt's most deadly hands. Don't forget to subscribe and ring that notification bell because we have so many more incredible Star Wars deep dives coming your way. And hey, drop a comment below and let me know where you're listening from right now. I love seeing our global Star Wars community come together for these epic stories. Now get comfortable. Maybe dim those lights, settle into your favorite spot, and prepare yourself for a tale that spans decades of brutal training, ancient Sith traditions, and the kind of power that comes with a price most beings could never imagine paying. Picture this. Over 130 years after the Battle of Endor, in the deepest chambers of Korriban's ancient Sith Academy, a young Twi'lek stands motionless as molten ink mixed with Sith alchemy burns its way beneath her skin. But these aren't just tattoos. They're living conduits to the dark side itself, each one earned through acts of brutality that would make even hardened warriors tremble. The pain is excruciating. But she doesn't break. She never breaks, because breaking means death, and she has chosen something far more dangerous than death. She has chosen transformation. The crimson needle bites deeper, and ancient Sith runes begin to glow with malevolent energy across her lekku. Each symbol represents a Jedi she's killed, a world she's helped conquer, a step closer to becoming something that no longer resembles the frightened child who was dragged from her homeworld years ago. The tattoo artist, himself a Sith Lord, pauses in his work and whispers, "Tell me, young one, do you understand what you're becoming?" She opens her eyes and they burn like twin suns of hatred. "I'm becoming what the galaxy needs me to be. I'm becoming perfection itself." But this moment of transformation is just one piece of an incredible story that would reshape the galaxy. Because what happened in that chamber wasn't just about becoming a Sith Lord. It was about how the dark side doesn't just corrupt, it evolves. It creates something so beautiful and so terrifying that even other Sith Lords step back in awe. This is the complete story of how an enslaved Twi'lek child became the most trusted hand of Darth Krayt, architect of the One Sith's galactic domination. We'll explore her brutal training on Korriban, her deadly hunts across the galaxy, her forbidden encounters with the last Skywalker, and the ancient Sith secrets that were literally carved into her flesh. Tonight we uncover a story about power and its price, about transformation and what we're willing to sacrifice to become something greater. It's about the seductive nature of the dark side, and how sometimes the most dangerous predators are the ones who were once just like us. Welcome to the complete story of Darth Talon, the tattooed Sith, whose very skin became a testament to the dark side's infinite capacity for beautiful destruction. More than 130 years have passed since Luke Skywalker faced his father above Endor. The galaxy has changed beyond recognition. The New Republic has fallen, replaced by a restored empire under the Fel dynasty. But even this new empire trembles before a greater darkness that has emerged from the ancient Sith homeworld. On Korriban, blood-red sands whisper with voices of long-dead Dark Lords. Ancient pyramids rise like monuments to hatred against the crimson sky, their surfaces carved with hieroglyphs that hurt to look at directly. Deep within these structures, past chambers filled with bones of failed apprentices, something new is being born. The One Sith have returned. Unlike traditional Sith, who followed the rule of two. These new dark side wielders embrace the rule of one, united under absolute authority of their emperor Darth Krayt. They are legion, they are patient, and they are more dangerous than any Sith order before them. Where ancient Sith destroyed themselves through infighting, the one Sith learned to harness collective hatred toward a single purpose: absolute galactic domination. Her original name has been lost to time, deliberately erased along with every trace of the frightened little girl who once lived on a conquered world where Twi'lek slaves were sold like livestock. She was approximately 7 years old when the Sith found her, huddled in a cage that reeked of fear and despair, her natural head tails trembling as buyers examined her like meat. Her skin was pale blue, almost white, unmarked by the tattoos that would later define her existence. But even as a terrified slave child, the Force flowed through her with unusual intensity. She couldn't control it, couldn't understand it, but when cruel slavers approached, sometimes their minds would cloud, sometimes they would stumble for no apparent reason. When her fear peaked, nearby objects would rattle and shake. This raw, untrained power caught the attention of Darth Talon, one of Krayt's most trusted hands. He moved through slave markets like a shadow given form, his lightsaber hidden beneath flowing robes, his presence causing even hardened criminals to step aside. His face was a map of scars and hatred, and when his eyes fell upon the trembling child, he smiled. Not the warm smile of rescue, but the cold smile of a predator recognizing potential. "This one," he said simply, tossing credits to the slaver. "She will serve the Sith." The slaver, suddenly eager to be rid of both child and terrifying customer, quickly unlocked her cage. "She's yours, Lord. May she bring you profit." Neil's smile widened, revealing teeth sharpened to points. "She will bring us something far more valuable than profit. She will bring us perfection." As he led the child away through spaceports onto a shuttle bound for Korriban, she tried to speak, tried to ask where they were going. But Nisil simply placed one scarred finger against her lips and whispered, "Your old life is ending, child. Do not mourn it. What awaits you is far greater than anything you could have imagined." The journey took 3 days. During that time, she watched through viewports as familiar stars gave way to unknown constellations. She watched her past disappear into the void, replaced by a future she couldn't comprehend. With each passing hour, something changed inside her. The fear remained, but it was joined by something darker. Something that whispered perhaps she didn't want to return to her old life after all. When their shuttle finally descended through Korriban's atmosphere, she pressed her face against the viewport and gasped. The entire planet pulsed with malevolent energy. Ancient Sith temples rose from the surface like massive fangs, and the very air shimmered with power. She could feel it calling to her, recognizing something within her she didn't know existed. Darth Talon noticed her fascination and nodded with approval. "Yes, child. Can you feel it? That is the power of the dark side. That is your birthright." As their shuttle touched down at the Academy landing platform, she took her first steps onto the world that would forge her into something legendary and terrible. She breathed air that tasted of copper and lightning, felt ancient stones beneath her feet thrum with accumulated hatred, and for the first time since her capture, she smiled. It wasn't the innocent smile of childhood. It was something far more dangerous. It was the smile of someone who had just found their true home. The academy doors sealed behind her with a sound like the closing of a tomb. Inside, corridors stretched endlessly into shadows that seemed to move independently. Ancient Sith hieroglyphs covered every surface, their meanings lost to most but radiating energy that made her skin crawl with both fear and anticipation. This was her new world now, where weakness meant death and strength was measured in the suffering of others. Darth Nihil led her through winding passages past chambers, where she glimpsed other children, some human, some alien, all bearing hollow expressions of those who had begun their transformation. Their eyes tracked her movement with predatory interest, calculating whether she might be competition or prey. She straightened her shoulders and met their gazes with defiance. She didn't know she possessed. The first lesson, Nihil said without turning around, is that everyone here wants to kill you. The second lesson is that you must want to kill them more. The weak serve the strong until they become strong enough to devour their masters. This is the natural order. They arrived at a circular chamber where dozens of children sat in perfect silence, ages ranging from perhaps 6 to 16 standard years. At the center stood a figure that made even Darth Nihil step back respectfully. This was Darth Maladi, the Devaronian Sith lady whose mastery of Sith alchemy had earned her a place among Krait's inner circle. Her red skin was marked with intricate scarification, and her horns had been carved with symbols that pulsed with dark side energy. Another lost lamb, Maladi observed, her voice carrying ancient authority. Tell me, child, what is your greatest fear? The question hung in the air like a blade. Around the circle, other students leaned forward slightly, sensing blood in the water. She felt their collective hunger, their hope that she would break immediately and provide entertainment. Something crystallized inside her, a core of stubborn pride that had somehow survived slavery and trauma. I fear nothing, she lied, lifting her chin. Miladi's laugh was like broken glass. Everyone fears something, but perhaps you fear the wrong things. She gestured, and the force slammed into the child like a physical blow, driving her to her knees. Pain exploded through every nerve, but she gritted her teeth and refused to cry out. Pain is not your enemy, Maladi continued, maintaining the force assault. Pain is your teacher. It shows you your limitations so you can transcend them. Do you understand? The child nodded, tears streaming down her face, but voice steady. I understand. The pressure vanished, leaving her gasping, but still upright. Around the circle, some students looked disappointed. The show was over so quickly. Others studied her with new interest, recognizing someone who might survive long enough to become a real threat. Good. You will begin training tomorrow at dawn. Failure to appear means death. Failure to improve means death. Failure to kill when commanded means death. Are there any questions? She shook her head, not trusting her voice. The dormitory was a stark stone chamber lined with simple beds. Most were occupied by children who regarded her arrival with suspicion and calculating interest. Neil deposited her at an empty bunk and left without another word. She sat on the thin mattress and took inventory of her situation. She was alone among enemies in a place designed to forge killers. She had no allies, no special skills, no advantages, except whatever raw force sensitivity had caught Nihil's attention. But as she studied the other children, she began to understand they were all in the same situation. They were all afraid, all desperate, all clinging to whatever scraps of strength they could find. That night, as darkness fell over Korriban, she lay awake listening to whispers and muffled sobs of children trying to process their new reality. Some prayed to gods who had already abandoned them. Others planned elaborate escapes that would never work. A few, the dangerous ones, were already plotting which fellow students to eliminate first. She made her own plans, but they were different. She would not just survive this place. She would master it. She would learn everything they tried to teach her and more besides. She would become so strong that even the Sith Lords would fear her. And someday, when she had claimed her power, she would repay every humiliation, every moment of terror, every drop of spilled blood. But first, she had to live through tomorrow. Dawn came too soon, announced by harsh clang of a metal gong echoing through the dormitory. Children stumbled from their beds, some half asleep, others alert and ready. She had barely slept but felt strangely energized, as if Korriban's dark side nexus was feeding her strength directly. The training courtyard was a broad expanse of black stone surrounded by towering walls carved with faces of ancient Sith lords. Their stone eyes seemed to watch with cruel amusement as new students were introduced to the reality of Sith education. Training implements were scattered around the space, from simple wooden practice swords to devices whose purpose she couldn't identify, but which radiated menace. Darth Talon stood at the center, flanked by several other Sith instructors. Today you begin your true education. You will learn that everything you believed about strength, about power, about yourself was a lie. We will strip away these illusions and reveal what lies beneath. She gestured to a rack of practice weapons. Choose your instrument of learning. Most children gravitated toward familiar-looking swords and staffs. A few picked up strange alien weapons from worlds they might have once called home. She moved past all of them to a pair of curved practice sabers that seemed to call to her. They felt right in her hands, balanced and deadly even in their training configuration. Interesting choice, Talon observed. Paired weapons require exceptional coordination and aggressive instincts. Most students lack the killer instinct to use them effectively. Most students aren't me, she replied, then immediately regretted the words. Around the courtyard, other children turned to stare with mixtures of admiration and hostility. She had just painted a target on her back. 6 months passed, like a fever dream of pain and progress. The nameless Twelk child, who had once cowered in slave cages, was disappearing, replaced by something harder and infinitely more dangerous. Her body had adapted to the brutal training regimen, muscles developing beyond what should have been possible for someone her age. More importantly, her connection to the Force was strengthening daily under careful cultivation of her Sith instructors. The Academy's ancient halls had become familiar territory. She knew which corridors to avoid during certain hours when older students prowled for easy victims. She understood the unspoken hierarchies that determined who lived and who became object lessons in the courtyard. Most critically, she had learned to read the moods of her instructors, sensing when to push forward and when to show appropriate deference. Darth Talon had taken particular interest in her development. The Devaronian Sith lady possessed knowledge of Force techniques that bordered on the supernatural, and she seemed to recognize something in her newest student that even other instructors missed. Their private sessions took place in a chamber deep beneath the Academy, where the walls themselves radiated dark side energy accumulated over millennia. Today we explore the true nature of power, Talon announced. During one such session, the chamber was lit only by flickering torches that cast dancing shadows across carved stone faces of long-dead Sith lords. Tell me, student, what do you believe strength is? She considered the question carefully. Months of training had taught her that hasty answers were often rewarded with painful corrections. Strength is the ability to impose your will on reality, to make the universe bend to your desires rather than accepting what others say is possible. A textbook answer, adequate but incomplete. Talon gestured toward a practice dummy positioned across the chamber. Destroy it. She extended her hand, channeling the Force with all the skill she had developed. Dark energy crackled between her fingers, and the dummy exploded into splinters and dust. It was a technique that would have been impossible for her just weeks earlier, but now felt as natural as breathing. Impressive. But you have misunderstood the fundamental nature of what you just accomplished. You believe you imposed your will on that object, but you are wrong. You invited the Force to act through you. You became a conduit for power that originates far beyond your individual existence. This is the first secret of true Sith mastery. The concept was staggering. She had been thinking of Force abilities as extensions of her personal strength, tools she could learn to wield. But Malady was suggesting something far more profound and dangerous. She was describing a relationship where the practitioner became less important than the energy flowing through them. I see understanding in your eyes. Malady continued. Good. Now comes the more difficult lesson. If you are merely a conduit, what happens when you try to channel more power than your mortal flesh can contain? Before she could respond, Malady raised her own hand. Dark side energy flooded the chamber with such intensity that the air itself seemed to burn. The stone floor beneath their feet cracked, and several torch flames flared into miniature infernos. The power was beautiful and terrifying, but she could see its cost written in the strain on Malady's scarified features. This is why the ancient Sith developed techniques to strengthen the vessel as well as increase the flow. Malady explained, lowering her hand. Physical conditioning, mental discipline, and spiritual transformation all serve to make you worthy of greater power. But there is another method, one that the Sith of this academy have perfected beyond anything attempted by our predecessors. She led her student to another chamber, this one lined with strange alchemical equipment that hummed with barely contained energy. Tables held instruments whose purpose she couldn't identify, and the air was thick with the scent of exotic chemicals and something darker. The walls were covered with anatomical diagrams showing humanoid figures marked with intricate tattoo patterns. Behold the art of Sith tattooing, Malady announced with obvious pride. Not mere decoration, but a form of permanent force enhancement that allows the practitioner to channel far greater power than their natural limitations would permit. Each mark is created using inks infused with rare minerals and Sith alchemy, then bonded to the recipient through exposure to specific forms of dark side energy. She studied the diagrams with growing fascination. The tattoo patterns weren't random. They followed precise geometric principles that seemed to map onto pressure points and energy channels throughout the body. It was like looking at blueprints for transforming a human being into a living force conduit. The process is excruciatingly painful, Malady continued matter-of-factly. Most students who attempt it die from shock or are driven insane by the intensity of dark side energy required to bond the tattoos properly. Those who survive find their connection to the Force permanently enhanced, their physical capabilities increased beyond normal limits, and their resistance to both physical and mental attacks dramatically improved. When can I begin? She asked immediately. Malady's laugh was like broken glass tinkling to the floor. Eager. I like that. But you are nowhere near ready for such transformation. The tattooing process requires not just physical preparation but spiritual readiness that comes only through proving yourself worthy of such power. You must first demonstrate mastery of more conventional techniques. Over the following weeks, her training intensified beyond anything she had experienced. Dawn brought lightsaber practice with Master Volt, a Zabrak whose cybernetic limbs clicked and whirred as he moved through combat forms that seemed to defy physical possibility. His teaching method involved attacking his students with lethal intent, forcing them to develop defensive skills through pure survival instinct. She excelled at lightsaber combat in ways that surprised even her instructors. The paired weapons she had chosen during her first day remained her preferred fighting style, and she was developing techniques that combined traditional forms with innovations born from her unique perspective. The ceremony took place 3 months later in the deepest chambers of the academy, where the walls themselves pulsed with dark side energy accumulated over millennia. She knelt in the center of a ritual circle carved from black stone and inlaid with metals that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Around her, a dozen Sith Lords formed a protective barrier against the malevolent forces that would be unleashed during her transformation. Darth Maladi approached carrying an obsidian case filled with instruments that gleamed with their own inner fire. The tattoo needles were not made of ordinary metal, but forged from rare minerals found only in the deepest caverns of Korriban. Each one had been bathed in the blood of fallen Jedi, and consecrated through rituals that would have driven lesser beings insane to witness. "Today you shed the last remnants of your old identity," Maladi announced, her voice echoing strangely in the vaulted chamber. "Today you become something new, something stronger, something worthy of the power you will wield. But remember, the dark side gives nothing freely. Every gift comes with a price, and that price is paid in pain." The first needle pierced the skin of her left leku with agony that exploded through her nervous system like liquid fire. But this was not ordinary tattoo ink flowing into her flesh. The substance burned with dark side energy, each drop carrying power that rewrote her very cellular structure. Ancient Sith runes began to form along her head-tail, each symbol representing mastery over a different aspect of the Force. Hours passed, in a blur of transcendent agony. The pain was beyond anything she had experienced, beyond what her instructors had warned her to expect. It felt as though molten metal was being poured through her veins while lightning danced beneath her skin. Several times she nearly lost consciousness, only to be pulled back to awareness by Maladi's urgent commands to remain present and aware. "You must stay conscious throughout the process," Maladi explained during a brief respite. "The tattoos bond with your Force essence, and if your spirit withdraws, they will become mere decoration instead of conduits for power. Pain is not your enemy today. It is the forge in which you will be reborn." By the time the ceremony concluded, intricate patterns covered both her leku and portions of her torso. The designs were not merely decorative, but followed precise geometric principles that channeled Force energy throughout her body. Each rune had been placed with mathematical precision, creating pathways that would allow her to access levels of power previously impossible for someone of her age and training. When she finally stood and examined her reflection in the polished obsidian walls, she barely recognized the being staring back at her. The pale blue Twi'lek child was gone, replaced by something that radiated danger and barely contained power. The tattoos seemed to move in the flickering torchlight, and her eyes now held depths that spoke of ancient knowledge and terrible purpose. "Your transformation is complete," Maladi announced, with obvious satisfaction. "You are no longer student. From this day forward, you shall be known as Darth Talon, Hand of the Emperor, Servant of the Dark Side." The name settled over her like a mantle of destiny. Darth Talon. It felt right in ways that her birth name never had, as though she had finally discovered her true identity after years of searching. She was no longer the frightened slave child who had arrived on Korriban. She was no longer the promising student who had excelled in training. She was something new entirely, something the galaxy had never seen before. The other Sith Lords in the chamber bowed their heads in acknowledgement of her new status. Even among the One Sith, becoming a true Darth was an achievement that commanded respect. She had endured the tattooing process that killed most who attempted it, and she had emerged stronger rather than broken. She was now one of Krait's hands, elite agents empowered to act with his full authority throughout the galaxy. Over the following weeks, she reveled in her new power and position. The tattoos had indeed transformed her in ways that went beyond the merely physical. Her connection to the Force had deepened exponentially, allowing her to perform feats that would have been impossible before her transformation. Force lightning flowed from her fingers with devastating intensity, and her lightsaber techniques had evolved to incorporate movements that seemed to defy physical law. More intoxicating than raw power was the respect she now commanded throughout the academy. Students who had once viewed her as a rival now stepped aside when she passed, recognizing the deadly potential that radiated from her tattooed form. Instructors who had treated her as just another promising pupil now spoke to her as an equal, seeking her opinions on academy matters and deferring to her judgment. She was assigned a private chamber befitting her new status, complete with meditation alcove and personal training area. The walls were decorated with artifacts recovered from ancient tombs, and a viewport looked out over Korriban's desolate landscape. For someone who had spent months sleeping in a crowded dormitory, the luxury was overwhelming. Her first missions as a hand took her beyond Korriban for the first time since her arrival at the academy. She traveled to worlds throughout the Outer Rim, hunting down Force-sensitive individuals who might pose threats to Sith plans or could be recruited for their own purposes. The work was exhilarating, finally putting her training to practical use against real enemies rather than academy opponents. Yet somehow, despite all her achievements and new status, she felt a strange emptiness. The transformation she had undergone was remarkable, but deep down she sensed this was not the end of her journey. The tattoos pulsed with power, but they had not eliminated all uncertainty. If anything, they had opened new questions about identity, purpose, and the true nature of the strength she had worked so hard to claim. The first false conclusion was that she had found her true self in becoming a Sith Lord. In reality, she had only taken another step on a path whose ultimate destination remained shrouded in shadow. The galaxy was changing in ways that most beings couldn't comprehend. From her position as one of Krait's hands, Talon witnessed the careful orchestration of events that would reshape civilization itself. The one Sith had spent decades infiltrating every level of galactic society, placing agents in positions of power while carefully manipulating conflicts to serve their ultimate purpose. Her assignments took her to worlds across the Outer Rim and beyond, each mission revealing another piece of the vast puzzle Krait was assembling. On Ossus, she observed Sith infiltrators posing as archaeologists while they searched ancient Jedi ruins for Force artifacts. On Coruscant, she met with Imperial intelligence operatives who had been turned years earlier and now served as eyes and ears within the Fel Empire's government. But it was during a mission to the medical research stations orbiting Dak that she encountered something that would change her understanding of the One Sith's true agenda. She had been sent to eliminate a Mon Calamari scientist who had allegedly discovered evidence of Sith involvement in recent galactic conflicts. What she found instead was far more disturbing. Dr. Kef Valar was not investigating Sith activities. He was investigating a mysterious plague that had begun appearing on worlds throughout the galaxy. The disease seemed to target Force-sensitive individuals specifically, causing horrific mutations and eventually death. But the most troubling aspect was that survivors of the plague sometimes displayed enhanced Force abilities, as though the disease was somehow rewriting their connection to the galactic energy field. "You're here to kill me," Valar said calmly when she entered his laboratory. He was an elderly Mon Calamari whose large eyes held the wisdom of someone who had seen too much. "But before you do, perhaps you should understand what your masters are really doing to the galaxy." She had come prepared to execute him quickly and efficiently. But something in his tone made her pause. He gestured to holographic displays showing cellular structures that seemed to writhe with their own malevolent life. "This plague is not natural. It's been engineered using biotechnology that combines Yuzhen Vong organic techniques with Sith alchemy. Someone is deliberately targeting Force users but not to kill them, to transform them into something else entirely." The implications were staggering. She thought of her own transformation through the tattooing process, the way Sith alchemy had permanently altered her connection to the Force. But this was something different. Something that could be deployed on a galactic scale to reshape entire populations of Force-sensitive beings. Who would have the knowledge and resources to create such a thing? She asked. Though part of her already suspected the answer. The same beings who perfected the art of using pain and alchemy to enhance Force sensitivity, Valar replied, his voice heavy with implication. The same ones who have been preparing for this moment for over a century. She killed him. Of course. Her loyalty to the one Sith demanded nothing less, but as she destroyed his research and eliminated all evidence of their conversation, she found herself questioning aspects of Krait's plan she had never considered before. The scope was becoming clear in ways that were both impressive and terrifying. Returning to Korriban, she sought out Darth Weirlock for guidance. The Chagrian Sith Lord was known for his vast knowledge of galactic history and his role as one of Krait's most trusted advisors. If anyone could help her understand the true nature of what she had witnessed, it would be him. She found him in the ancient library complex beneath the Academy, surrounded by holocrons and scrolls that contained the accumulated wisdom of Sith Lords stretching back thousands of years. His pale features were illuminated by the blue glow of an active holocron, and his attention seemed focused on information that required his complete concentration. "Ah, young Talon," he said, without looking up from his studies. "I trust your mission to Dak was successful." "The target has been eliminated," she confirmed. "But I have questions about what I discovered there." "I imagine you do." He finally turned to face her, his red eyes holding depths that spoke of knowledge both vast and terrible. "The galaxy is entering a new phase of evolution, one that will require difficult choices from all who serve the dark side. What you witnessed was merely one tool among many that will be necessary to achieve our ultimate goals." She chose her words carefully, aware that even among the Sith hierarchy, there were limits to how much questioning was considered acceptable. "The scope of the operation seems to extend far beyond anything I was prepared for. The biological weapon, the infiltration networks, the systematic targeting of Force users, these suggest a plan that encompasses the entire galaxy." "Because it does," Weirlock replied simply. "The one Sith did not emerge from hiding to claim territory or establish temporary dominion. We seek fundamental transformation of galactic civilization itself. The old orders, Jedi and Sith alike, have proven themselves incapable of bringing true peace and stability to the galaxy. New methods are required." He gestured to the holocrons surrounding them, their soft glow reflecting off the chamber's ancient stone walls. "For generations the Sith have been constrained by tradition, by the rule of two, by petty conflicts over individual power. Emperor Krait envisions something far greater, a unified galactic civilization under Sith guidance, where the Force is used not for personal ambition but for the collective advancement of all sentient life." The philosophy was seductive in its scope and ambition. Talon had experienced firsthand the chaos and suffering that plagued the galaxy under the current system of competing governments and ideologies. The prospect of unified purpose, of strength directed toward constructive rather than destructive ends, appealed to aspects of her personality she hadn't fully acknowledged. "And the price for this transformation?" she asked. "Every meaningful change requires sacrifice," Weirlock replied. "Some beings will resist the new order, clinging to outdated notions of individual freedom over collective prosperity. They will need to be eliminated or transformed. Others will embrace the opportunity to become part of something greater than themselves. The biological agents you discovered are simply tools to accelerate the process." As she left the library and walked through Korriban's silent corridors, Talon found herself contemplating the magnitude of what she had learned. The One Sith were not merely another group seeking political power. They were attempting to engineer the evolution of galactic civilization itself, using methods that combined ancient Sith wisdom with cutting-edge biotechnology. Her tattoos pulsed with dark side energy as she meditated on these revelations. She had thought her transformation complete when she became a Sith Lord, but now she understood that her personal evolution was simply one small part of a much larger metamorphosis. The galaxy itself was being prepared for transformation, and she would be one of the agents responsible for guiding that process. The peaceful corridors of the Academy took on new meaning as she walked through them. This was not just a training ground for individual Sith Lords, but a laboratory for developing techniques that would reshape entire worlds. Every lesson in pain tolerance, every exercise in force manipulation, every meditation on the nature of power was preparation for work that would echo across generations. Yet beneath her growing understanding of the plan's scope, doubts continued to whisper. The methods being employed were undeniably effective, but they required a level of suffering and transformation that even she found disturbing. How much of the galaxy's current population would survive the transition to Krait's new order? And would the beings who emerged from that transformation still be recognizably the same species that had populated the galaxy for millennia? These were questions she could not voice openly, even among fellow Sith Lords. But they followed her into her meditation chamber, where she sat in lotus position, surrounded by artifacts of ancient power, trying to find peace with the role she had chosen to play in reshaping the galaxy's destiny. Deep within Korriban's most sacred chambers, Talon discovered that her questions about the One Sith's methods were not unique. The spirits of ancient Dark Lords, their essences preserved for millennia within the planet's dark side nexus, had witnessed the rise and fall of countless Sith orders. Their whispered counsel provided perspective that living Sith Lords either couldn't or wouldn't share. The Valley of the Dark Lords held tombs that predated written galactic history. Each massive structure contained not just the physical remains of ancient Sith, but echoes of their knowledge and experience. During her private meditations, Talon began to sense these presences, their voices carrying across the centuries to offer wisdom born from their own struggles with the seductive nature of ultimate power. It was in the tomb of Darth Revan that she first encountered a spirit willing to engage in direct communication. The ancient Sith Lord's essence materialized as a shimmering figure whose features shifted between light and shadow, reflecting the complex duality that had defined his existence thousands of years earlier. "You seek understanding," Revan's spirit observed, his voice echoing strangely in the tomb's burial chamber. "You sense that the path you follow leads to destinations your masters have not fully revealed. This uncertainty troubles you, because you recognize that once certain thresholds are crossed, there can be no return to what was." Talon knelt respectfully before the apparition, aware that she was in the presence of one of the most powerful Force users in galactic history. "I serve the One Sith faithfully, but I struggle to understand how the methods we employ serve the greater good. The biological weapons, the systematic elimination of opposition, the transformation of entire populations, these seem to contradict the very stability we claim to seek." Revan's ghostly form moved closer, and she could feel the weight of his ancient presence pressing against her consciousness. "I once faced similar choices during my own attempts to save the galaxy from the true Sith Empire. I believed that temporary tyranny was preferable to total annihilation, that sacrifice of the few was justified by preservation of the many. But power, once claimed in the name of necessity, develops its own momentum." The tomb's walls were covered with hieroglyphs, depicting Revan's greatest victories and most terrible defeats. As she studied these ancient carvings, Talon began to understand that every generation of Sith faced the same fundamental question about the relationship between individual ambition and collective benefit. "What would you have done differently?" she asked. I would have remembered that the dark side offers power but not wisdom, Revan replied. It amplifies existing desires and ambitions, but does not provide moral clarity about how that power should be used. Every Sith Lord believes their vision represents ultimate truth, but perspective is limited by the very nature of dark side corruption. Over the following weeks, Talon made pilgrimages to other tombs throughout the valley. Each ancient spirit she encountered offered different perspectives on the eternal questions that plagued Force users. Darth Bane spoke of the necessity of conflict in driving evolution. Darth Plagueis shared insights about the relationship between life and death that transcended traditional understanding. Darth Sidious, more recent but no less influential, described the intoxicating nature of absolute power and its tendency to corrupt even the most noble intentions. But it was her encounter with the spirit of Darth Krayt's predecessor, the ancient Sith Lord Darth Ended, that provided the most disturbing insights. His essence was bound to artifacts within his tomb, and his perspective on the current One Sith agenda carried the weight of someone who had witnessed its development from the very beginning. The Emperor believes he has transcended the failures of previous Sith orders, Nd's spirit revealed during a particularly intense meditation session. But he has simply replaced one form of corruption with another. Where the rule of two bred destructive competition, the rule of one breeds stagnant conformity. True power requires balance between opposing forces, not the elimination of all opposition. These conversations with ancient spirits began to influence Talon's understanding of her own transformation and role within the One Sith hierarchy. She realized that her tattoos, while granting tremendous power, had also marked her as belonging to a specific interpretation of Sith philosophy. She was no longer simply a Force user who had chosen the dark side. She was a living embodiment of Krayt's vision for what Sith Lords should become. The recognition brought both pride and unease. The power flowing through her enhanced form was undeniable, allowing her to accomplish feats that would have been impossible through traditional training alone. But the process had also limited her in ways she was only beginning to understand. Her connection to the Force had been channeled along specific pathways designed to serve the One Sith's collective purpose rather than her individual potential. During one particularly profound meditation in Darth Revan's tomb, she experienced a vision that challenged everything she thought she understood about her destiny. She saw herself as she might have become had she chosen a different path, someone who wielded tremendous power but remained free to determine how that power would be used. The alternative version of herself was both more and less than what she had become, possessing different strengths but also different limitations. Every choice shapes not just who we become, but who we could have been, Revan's spirit explained. As the vision faded, the path you have chosen offers security and belonging, but at the cost of infinite possibility. Whether this trade was worthwhile depends on what you value most deeply. The question haunted her as she returned to her duties as a Hand of the Emperor. Her missions took on new complexity, as she found herself observing not just the immediate objectives, but the long-term implications of each action. When she eliminated opposition groups, she wondered whether they might have evolved into valuable allies given different circumstances. When she recruited Force-sensitive individuals for Sith training, she questioned whether their potential was being fully realized or artificially constrained. These doubts remained private, buried beneath layers of loyalty and conditioning that made open rebellion impossible. But they influenced her methods in subtle ways. She began seeking solutions that achieved mission objectives while minimizing unnecessary destruction. She started identifying individuals whose talents might be better served through persuasion rather than coercion. Small acts of mercy that could be rationalized as strategic thinking, but which really stemmed from growing uncertainty about the righteousness of her cause. The ancient spirits had given her something more dangerous than knowledge. They had given her perspective. and perspective once gained could never be completely forgotten. The holographic briefing chamber aboard Crate's flagship represented the apex of Sith technological achievement. Advanced projection systems created three-dimensional maps of the galaxy that could be manipulated with force gestures, while real-time intelligence feeds provided constant updates on political and military developments across thousands of worlds. It was here that Talon received the assignment that would change the trajectory of her existence. Emperor Crate himself presided over the briefing, his ancient form sustained by cybernetic enhancements and sheer force of will. The Yuzhan Vong implants that had nearly killed him decades earlier were clearly visible beneath his pale skin, creating patterns that pulsed with their own alien rhythm. Despite his physical deterioration, his presence dominated the chamber with an authority that made even veteran Sith lords step carefully. "The galaxy approaches a critical juncture," Crate announced, his voice carrying the weight of absolute conviction. "Our long-term preparations are nearing completion, but one significant obstacle remains to be addressed. The Skywalker bloodline persists, carrying within it the potential to disrupt everything we have worked to achieve." Talon felt a thrill of anticipation, mixed with apprehension. The Skywalker name was legendary throughout the galaxy, associated with both the greatest victories and most devastating defeats in recent history. That any member of that bloodline still lived was itself surprising, given the systematic elimination of Jedi that had followed the Sith takeover. Darth Wirelock activated the holographic display, showing images and data files related to their target. Cade Skywalker, descendant of the legendary Luke Skywalker, represents a unique threat to our operations. His force sensitivity is exceptional, but more importantly, he possesses abilities that could potentially undermine the biological transformation protocols we have spent decades developing. The hologram showed a young human male whose features carried unmistakable echoes of his famous ancestry. But there was something different about his force signature, something that made traditional Sith detection methods less effective. Intelligence reports suggested he had walked away from Jedi training years earlier, choosing instead to work as a bounty hunter and smuggler in the galaxy's criminal underworld. His precise abilities remain unclear, Wirelock continued, but preliminary reports suggest he may possess some form of force healing technique that could counteract our biological agents. More concerning is the possibility that his blood carries genetic markers that could be used to develop immunity to our transformation protocols. Crate's cybernetic breathing apparatus hissed softly as he considered the implications. The Skywalker bloodline has always represented chaos in the Force, the ability to upset carefully laid plans through unpredictable actions. We cannot allow such uncertainty to threaten our final victory. The bloodline must be eliminated or brought under our control. The assignment's parameters were elegant in their simplicity. Talon would hunt down Cade Skywalker using all resources at her disposal. If possible, she should capture him alive for interrogation and study. If capture proved impossible, elimination was authorized. Under no circumstances should he be allowed to escape or make contact with other Force users who might benefit from his unique abilities. "Why me?" Talon asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Because you represent everything he is not," Crate replied with something that might have been a smile. "He is chaotic, undisciplined, driven by emotion rather than purpose. You are controlled, focused, shaped by pain into perfection. When you confront him, he will see what he could have become, had he embraced rather than rejected his Force heritage." The psychological dimensions of the assignment were as important as the tactical ones. Crate wanted more than simply the elimination of a threat. He wanted a demonstration of Sith superiority over the scattered remnants of Jedi philosophy. Talon would serve as living proof that disciplined suffering produced stronger results than undirected potential. Her hunt for Cade Skywalker began in the criminal underworld of the Outer Rim, where smugglers and bounty hunters operated beyond the reach of Imperial law. These were dangerous places where violence was currency and loyalty could be purchased for the right price. But they were also environments where individuals could disappear completely if they understood how to navigate the complex networks of criminal organizations. Initial intelligence suggested Skywalker operated primarily in sectors controlled by the Black Sun Syndicate, using their protection and resources to avoid Imperial entanglements, but tracking him proved more difficult than expected. His force sensitivity seemed muted somehow, as though he was deliberately suppressing his abilities to avoid detection. Traditional methods of force tracking yielded only intermittent results, forcing her to rely on conventional investigation techniques. The hunt took her to dozens of worlds, from the gambling dens of Nar Shaddaa to the mining colonies of the corporate sector. Each lead provided pieces of a larger puzzle, revealing a man who seemed to be running not just from Imperial pursuit, but from his own destiny. Witnesses described someone who possessed obvious force abilities, but used them reluctantly, as though each demonstration of power caused him personal pain. It was on Tatooine, in a cantina that catered to spacers and smugglers, that she finally caught a glimpse of her quarry. Cade Skywalker sat alone at a corner table nursing a drink while watching the crowd with eyes that missed nothing. Even across the smoky room, she could sense the force potential radiating from him like heat from a furnace. But there was something else as well. A darkness that suggested his rejection of Jedi training had not protected him from the galaxy's corrupting influences. She studied him carefully, noting the way other patrons instinctively gave him space despite his casual appearance. His clothes were those of a common smuggler, but his posture and alertness marked him as someone accustomed to violence. Most telling were his hands, which bore the calluses of someone who had spent considerable time training with lightsabers despite his supposed rejection of Jedi ways. The confrontation, when it came, was unlike anything she had anticipated. Rather than flee or fight, Skywalker seemed almost relieved to be found. "I wondered when they would send someone," he said quietly, not even turning to look at her as she approached his table. "I'm surprised it took this long." His acceptance of her presence was unsettling in ways she hadn't expected. This was supposed to be a hunt, a demonstration of Sith superiority over scattered Jedi remnants. Instead, she found herself facing someone who seemed to welcome whatever fate she represented. "You know why I'm here," she said, taking the seat across from him. "To kill me or capture me," he replied simply. "The question is, which option serves your masters better?" The conversation that followed would reshape both their destinies in ways neither could fully anticipate. The cantina's atmosphere grew thick with tension as Talon studied the man across from her. Cade Skywalker possessed an aura that defied easy categorization. His force signature was powerful yet fragmented, as though something fundamental within him had been broken and imperfectly repaired. When he finally looked up to meet her gaze, his eyes held depths that spoke of experiences no being should have to endure. "You're not what I expected," she admitted, her hand resting casually near her lightsaber hilt. The admission was tactical, designed to keep him talking while she assessed the best approach for his capture. "People rarely are," Cade replied, taking another sip of his drink. "Your Emperor probably told you I was some kind of fallen Jedi, a waste of potential that needed to be eliminated. But the truth is more complicated than that." Around them, the cantina's other patrons were beginning to sense danger. Conversations grew quieter, and several beings near the exits began making discreet departures. Violence had a particular smell in places like this, and experienced criminals knew when to avoid becoming collateral damage. "Enlighten me," Talon said, genuinely curious despite herself. Her mission parameters were clear: but understanding her target's psychology might provide advantages during the inevitable confrontation. Cade leaned back in his chair, and for a moment his careful control slipped. The force rippled around him with such intensity that nearby glasses rattled on their tables. When he spoke again, his voice carried pain that had been carefully buried but never truly healed. "I was trained by my father, Cole Skywalker, at the Jedi Academy on Ulsus. Traditional Jedi education, complete with lectures about peace, justice, and the light side of the Force. But when the Sith attacked the Academy, when I watched my father die protecting students who couldn't protect themselves, I learned that all those noble ideals meant nothing against real power. The attack on Ulsus had been one of the One Sith's early victories, a carefully orchestrated strike designed to eliminate the next generation of Jedi before they could become threats. Talon had studied the mission reports, but hearing about its consequences from a survivor's perspective added dimensions she hadn't considered. "I tried to save him," Cade continued, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "I reached out through the Force, tried to heal his wounds, tried to bring him back from the edge of death, and for a moment it worked. I felt his life force stabilizing, felt him returning to consciousness. But then something else happened, something the Jedi never taught us about." He held up his hands, and Talon could see faint scars across his palms that seemed to pulse with their own internal rhythm. "The Force flowed through me in ways I'd never experienced. It wasn't just healing, it was resurrection, bringing back something that had already crossed the boundary between life and death. But that kind of power comes with a price." The implications were staggering. If Cade Skywalker truly possessed the ability to resurrect the dead, he represented a threat to the One Sith that went far beyond anything their intelligence had suggested. Such power could potentially undo years of careful elimination of key opposition figures. "You're lying," Talon said. Though even as she spoke the words, she could sense their falsehood. The Force didn't lie, and Cade's emotions were too raw, too genuine to be fabricated. "I wish I were," he replied, "because bringing someone back from death doesn't return them unchanged. My father came back, but he came back wrong. The thing that wore his face, that spoke with his voice, wasn't really him anymore. It was something else, something hungry and cold that pretended to be the man I'd loved." The cantina had grown almost completely silent now, as though the weight of Cade's confession was pressing down on everyone present. Even beings who couldn't sense the Force seemed to understand that something momentous was being revealed. "I had to kill him again," Cade whispered, his voice breaking slightly. "I had to destroy the abomination I'd created while it still wore my father's face, and in that moment I understood why the Jedi forbid such techniques. Some boundaries aren't meant to be crossed, no matter how noble the intention." Talon felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cantina's climate control. Her own transformation through Sith tattooing had involved crossing boundaries between life and death, allowing dark side energy to literally rewrite her cellular structure. How different was that from what Cade described? And if his abilities could reverse such transformations, what did that mean for the One Sith's biological weapons programs? "That's why you rejected Jedi training," she said, understanding beginning to dawn. "Not because you lacked commitment, but because you possessed too much power to safely control. The Jedi way requires balance, restraint, careful consideration of consequences," Cade replied. "But when you can feel every living being's pain as though it were your own, when you can sense death approaching and know you have the power to prevent it, restraint becomes impossible. I was becoming something the Jedi couldn't safely train, so I chose exile instead." The revelation recontextualized everything. Talon thought she knew about her mission. Crate hadn't sent her to eliminate a failed Jedi or capture a potential asset. He had sent her after someone whose very existence challenged the fundamental assumptions underlying Sith philosophy. If life and death were not absolute boundaries, if the Force could be used to transcend even mortality itself, then what did that mean for beings like herself who had sacrificed their humanity in pursuit of power? "Your Emperor knows what I can do," Cade continued, his voice taking on harder edges. "That's why he wants me captured, rather than killed. He thinks my abilities can be harnessed, turned to serve his vision of galactic transformation. But he doesn't understand that some powers corrupt simply through possession, regardless of the wielder's intentions." As if summoned by his words, the cantina's doors burst open, and Imperial stormtroopers poured into the room. Talon's backup had arrived. Though she hadn't called for them, someone else was orchestrating this confrontation. Someone who wanted to ensure that Cade Skywalker didn't escape regardless of what revelations emerged during their conversation. The betrayal stung, but not as much as the realization that she was no longer operating as a trusted agent, but as an expendable asset. Her masters had anticipated that talking with Skywalker might compromise her loyalty, so they had prepared contingencies that didn't require her willing cooperation. "Looks like talking time is over," Cade said, his demeanor shifting from melancholic to alert. "Question is, are you going to help them take me, or are you going to find out what it feels like to choose your own path for once?" The choice before her represented more than tactical considerations. It was a fundamental question about who she was and who she wanted to become. The Sith had given her power and purpose, but they had also made her into a tool to be used and discarded when convenient. Cade represented something different, the possibility that power could exist without absolute submission to another's will. As the stormtroopers raised their weapons and shouted demands for surrender, Talon found herself standing at a crossroads that would define the rest of her existence. The tattoos beneath her skin pulsed with dark side energy, urging her toward familiar patterns of obedience and violence. But something deeper, something that had been awakening during her conversations with ancient Sith spirits, whispered of alternatives she had never considered. The moment stretched like a held breath, pregnant with infinite possibility. Whatever choice she made in the next few seconds would ripple across the galaxy in ways none of them could fully predict. The hidden truth wasn't just about Cade's abilities or the One Sith's plans, it was about the fundamental nature of choice itself and whether beings shaped by power could ever truly be free. The stormtroopers never had a chance to fire their weapons. Talon's lightsabers ignited in a crimson blur, her enhanced reflexes and force-augmented speed turning her into a whirlwind of destruction. But to her surprise, Cade didn't simply flee during the chaos. Instead, he fought beside her, his own lightsaber blazing blue as he moved through combat forms that were both familiar and startlingly innovative. Their fighting styles complemented each other in ways that defied logical explanation. Where her strikes were precise and calculated, his were intuitive and flowing. Where she relied on enhanced physical capabilities, he seemed to anticipate attacks before they developed. Together, they carved through the Imperial assault team with an efficiency that left the cantina's surviving patrons stunned. When the last stormtrooper fell, an uncomfortable silence settled over the destroyed establishment. Bodies lay scattered among overturned tables and shattered glassware, while smoke from damaged equipment created a haze that stung the eyes. Talon and Cade stood back to back in the center of the devastation, both breathing hard but uninjured. "We need to leave," Cade said, deactivating his lightsaber. "That was just the advance team. They'll send heavier forces once they realize what happened here." "Where can we go?" Talon asked, the question revealing more about her psychological state than she intended. For the first time since becoming a Sith Lord, she was truly alone, cut off from the support systems that had defined her existence for years. "I know a place," Cade replied. "Somewhere we can talk without interruption. But first, you need to understand that helping me makes you a traitor in your Emperor's eyes. There's no going back from this choice." As they fled Tatooine aboard Cade's modified light freighter, Talon found herself questioning everything she thought she knew about loyalty, purpose, and the nature of power itself. The ship's cramped quarters forced them into close proximity, and she began to sense aspects of Cade's personality that hadn't been apparent during their brief cantina encounter. He was damaged in ways that went beyond physical scars, carrying psychological wounds that had never properly healed. But unlike her own trauma, which had been channeled into controlled aggression through Sith training, his pain remained raw and unprocessed. He felt everything too deeply, experienced others' suffering as though it were his own, and the weight of that empathy was slowly crushing him. Their destination proved to be a hidden asteroid base that served as a safe house for individuals fleeing Imperial persecution. The facility was crude but functional, carved from solid rock and equipped with basic life support systems. More importantly, it was shielded against force detection, making it effectively invisible to Sith hunting techniques. "Welcome to my home away from home," Cade said, as their ship settled into a concealed docking bay. "Not much to look at, but it keeps the Sith away." The base's other inhabitants were a diverse collection of refugees, smugglers, and resistance fighters, who had all found reasons to oppose Imperial rule. Talon recognized several species that had been targeted for elimination or forced conversion under the One Sith's biological weapons programs. Seeing them alive and free created cognitive dissonance that challenged her fundamental assumptions about the righteousness of her former cause. Over the following days, she listened to stories that provided perspective on the One Sith's activities from the victim's point of view. A Bothan intelligence operative described watching his entire family transformed into mindless servants through engineered plague exposure. A former Imperial officer spoke of being ordered to eliminate civilian populations who showed signs of force sensitivity. A Twi'lek dancer, her own species, recounted being sold into slavery by officials who claimed such actions served the greater good. Each testimony was like a blow to carefully constructed rationalizations that had allowed her to justify years of brutality. She had told herself that the suffering she caused served higher purposes, that temporary cruelty was necessary to achieve lasting peace. But faced with the actual consequences of those actions, such justifications seemed hollow and self-serving. "You're questioning everything you believed," Cade observed during one of their private conversations. "I can see it in your eyes, feel it in the force around you. It's like watching someone wake up from a dream that's become a nightmare." They were sitting in the base's modest common area, sharing a simple meal while other refugees went about their daily routines. The normalcy of the scene was jarring after years of living among beings who viewed compassion as weakness and mercy as failure. "I was taught that strength came through suffering," Talon replied, her voice carrying uncertainty. She rarely allowed others to hear. That power justified any sacrifice, that the weak deserved their fate, because they lacked the will to become strong. But seeing these people, listening to their stories, I'm beginning to wonder if strength means something different than what the Sith taught me. "The Sith aren't wrong about everything," Cade said carefully. "Power does matter, and sometimes violence is necessary to protect what's important. But they make the mistake of thinking that power is an end in itself rather than a tool to serve something greater." His words reminded her of conversations with ancient Sith spirits who had expressed similar doubts about the path she was following. Even legendary Dark Lords, who had achieved everything the Sith promised, had ultimately found their victories hollow, and their power insufficient to bring the satisfaction they sought. "What would you have me do?" she asked. "I am what the Sith made me," These tattoos aren't just decoration. They're permanent modifications that tie me to the dark side in ways that can't be undone. Even if I wanted to change, I'm not sure it's possible. Cade was quiet for a long moment, studying her tattooed features with an intensity that made her uncomfortable. When he finally spoke, his voice carried conviction that surprised her. The tattoos channel dark side energy, but they don't control your choices. You're still free to decide how that power gets used. The question isn't whether you can change what you are, but whether you're willing to change what you do. That night, alone in her assigned quarters, Talon examined her reflection in a polished metal surface. The intricate patterns covering her skin told the story of her transformation from slave child to Sith Lord. Each symbol represented power claimed through pain, strength earned through suffering. But looking at them now, she wondered if they might also represent limitations she had accepted without questioning. The dark side energy flowing through the tattoos was undeniable, but perhaps Cade was right about choice remaining possible. Perhaps the real test of strength wasn't the ability to cause suffering, but the courage to choose differently when alternatives presented themselves. As she drifted off to sleep, her dreams were filled with images of ancient Sith lords who whispered warnings about the seductive nature of absolute certainty. Power, they seemed to be saying, was most dangerous when it convinced its wielders that they had found ultimate truth. The peaceful interlude at the asteroid base couldn't last forever. Imperial intelligence had resources that could track almost anyone given sufficient time and motivation. And the destruction of an entire stormtrooper squad on Tatooine had definitely attracted attention. When the first probe droids appeared in the system's outer reaches, Cade knew their sanctuary had been compromised. "We have maybe 6 hours before the main force arrives," he announced, during an emergency gathering of the base's residents. "Everyone needs to evacuate immediately. Take only what you can carry and scatter to your predetermined safe zones." The efficiency of the evacuation spoke to careful preparation and grim experience. These were people who had learned to live with the constant threat of discovery, always ready to abandon everything and start over somewhere else. Watching families pack precious possessions into single bags while children tried to understand why they had to leave their toys behind, Talon felt the weight of responsibility for their displacement. "This is because of me," she said quietly, to Cade as they watched the refugees load onto various ships. "They're running because I brought Imperial attention here." "They've been running long before you arrived," he replied. "The Empire has been hunting people like us since Crate took power. At least now they have advance warning instead of waking up to stormtroopers breaking down their doors." But his reassurance couldn't eliminate the guilt gnawing at her conscience. These people had offered her shelter despite knowing she was Sith, had shared their stories despite the risk she represented. Their kindness seemed incomprehensible after years of living in environments where compassion was viewed as weakness. As the last refugee ship departed, Cade turned to face her with an expression that mixed determination with resignation. "We can't keep running forever. Eventually we have to make a stand, and that means confronting the people who made us what we are." "You mean Emperor Crate," she said, understanding the implications immediately, among others. "But first, there's someone else we need to find. Someone who might have answers about breaking the kind of conditioning you've undergone." Their next destination was a world Talon had never heard of. A remote planet in the unknown regions where ancient Force traditions had survived outside the influence of both Jedi and Sith. The journey took them through hyperspace routes that weren't on any official charts, paths known only to smugglers and others who needed to travel beyond Imperial surveillance. The planet itself was beautiful in ways that challenged her preconceptions about what strength looked like. Instead of the harsh, unforgiving landscapes of Sith worlds like Korriban, This place featured flowing rivers, peaceful forests, and settlements that seemed to exist in harmony with their natural surroundings. The inhabitants were human variants who had developed unique relationships with the Force through centuries of isolation. They call themselves the Healers, Cade explained, as their ship descended toward a landing platform carved from living wood. They've spent generations studying techniques for repairing damage caused by dark side corruption. If anyone can help you understand your tattoos differently, it's them. The Healer's leader was an elderly woman whose presence radiated calm in ways that reminded Talon of ancient Jedi descriptions she had read. But unlike the detached serenity often associated with Jedi Masters, this woman's peace seemed to embrace rather than transcend emotional experience. "I am Elder Senna," she said, as they were welcomed into the settlement's central hall. "Cade has told us about your situation through the Force networks we maintain. You carry great pain, child, but also great potential for healing." The examination that followed was unlike anything Talon had experienced. Instead of probing her tattoos with instruments or invasive Force techniques, Elder Senna simply sat across from her and opened herself to empathic connection. For the first time in years, Talon felt truly seen not as a weapon or tool but as a living being whose suffering mattered. "The markings on your skin are indeed powerful," Senna explained after the session concluded. "They channel dark side energy in ways that enhance your physical capabilities and Force sensitivity. But they are not irreversible modifications. They are choices, made permanent through repetition and reinforcement." The concept was revolutionary. Everything Talon had been taught suggested that Sith tattoos created fundamental changes that couldn't be undone. The idea that they might represent decisions rather than destiny opened possibilities she had never considered. "How is that possible?" she asked. "The energy flowing through them feels permanent, integral to who I am." "Energy flows where attention goes," Senna replied with a gentle smile. "For years you have focused your consciousness through pathways designed to channel rage, hatred, and domination. The tattoos facilitate this focus, making such emotional states feel natural and inevitable. But consciousness itself remains flexible. With proper guidance, you can learn to direct your attention differently." Over the following weeks, Talon underwent training that challenged every assumption she held about the nature of power and identity. The Healers taught meditation techniques that allowed her to observe her own thought patterns without being consumed by them. They showed her how to access Force abilities through compassion rather than anger, how to find strength in connection rather than dominance. The process was exhausting in ways that made Sith training seem simple by comparison. It was far easier to embrace hatred than to acknowledge the fear underlying it. Simpler to strike out at perceived enemies than to examine the wounds that made violence seem necessary. But gradually, she began to sense possibilities beyond the narrow channels her conditioning had created. "I can feel the difference," she told Cade during one of their evening walks through the settlement's gardens. "The tattoos are still there, still channeling energy, but it doesn't feel as overwhelming. Like I have some choice in how that energy gets used." "The real test will come when we face serious threats," he warned. "It's easy to choose compassion in peaceful surroundings, much harder when someone's trying to kill you." That test would come sooner than either of them expected. Imperial forces had been systematically searching worlds in the unknown regions, following the same routes Cade had used to reach the Healer's sanctuary. When the first Star Destroyer dropped out of hyperspace above their peaceful world, both Talon and Cade knew their time of learning was over. The shadow of their past had finally caught up with them. And now they would discover whether the wisdom they had gained could survive contact with the brutal realities of galactic conflict. The Imperial fleet that emerged from hyperspace was unlike anything Talon had seen during her years as a Sith hand. 3 Star Destroyers, accompanied by dozens of support vessels, created a wall of metal and firepower that blotted out the stars. But it was the presence she felt emanating from the flagship that truly chilled her to the bone. Emperor Krayt himself had come to reclaim his wayward servant. "He's here," she whispered to Cade, as they watched the fleet assume orbital positions. "I can feel his presence like ice in my veins. He didn't send others to collect me. He came personally." The healer's settlement transformed into organized chaos as civilians were evacuated to underground shelters, carved deep into the planet's bedrock. Elder Senna moved among her people with calm efficiency, but Talon could sense the fear radiating from beings who had lived their entire lives in peaceful isolation. They had no experience with the kind of violence that was about to descend upon their world. "This is my fault," Talon said. "Watching children being hurried into protective bunkers. All of this suffering because I dared to question my training." "No," Cade replied firmly. "This is Krayt's fault for creating a system that turns people into weapons and then discards them when they develop inconvenient consciences. You're not responsible for his choices." The first wave of assault shuttles began their descent. Within hours of the fleet's arrival, stormtroopers poured from landing craft, while TIE fighters screamed overhead. But the real threat came with the second wave. Sith Lords materialized from drop pods like falling stars of malevolent energy, their lightsabers igniting before their feet touched the ground. Talon recognized several of them from her years at the Academy. Darth Maladi led the assault, her scarified features twisted with fury at her former student's betrayal. Darth Nihil flanked her. The warrior who had first recognized Talon's potential now committed to eliminating what he viewed as a failed experiment. Behind them came newer hands, younger Sith Lords eager to prove themselves by destroying a traitor to the cause. "You cannot hide from what you are." Maladi's amplified voice echoed across the settlement as she advanced through the gardens. "The tattoos mark you as ours. The power flowing through your veins was bought with Imperial blood and Sith alchemy. Return to your Emperor's service and your death will be swift." The words triggered responses. Talon had thought she'd overcome during her time with the healers. Her tattoos blazed with dark side energy as rage flooded through carefully constructed mental barriers. For a moment she was once again the perfect Sith weapon, shaped by pain and conditioned for violence. But then she felt Cade's presence beside her, calm and centered in ways that reminded her of the alternatives she had discovered. The meditation techniques Elder Senna had taught her provided anchor points in the storm of emotion, allowing her consciousness to observe the rage without being consumed by it. "I am not yours anymore," she called back, igniting her lightsabers. "I choose how my power gets used." The battle that followed would be remembered in Sith annals as the moment when their perfect weapon turned against them. Talon fought with abilities enhanced by years of brutal conditioning, but guided by principles she had learned from beings who valued life over domination. Her strikes were no less deadly, but they served protection rather than conquest. Cade fought beside her with techniques that blended Jedi training with innovations born from years of exile. His healing abilities manifested in combat as an uncanny ability to sense and counter his opponent's attacks before they fully developed. Where traditional Jedi might have sought to disable rather than kill, Cade showed no such restraint against beings who threatened innocent lives. But even their combined skills couldn't hold back the full weight of the Imperial assault indefinitely. Stormtroopers established perimeters while Sith Lords pressed forward with coordinated attacks designed to overwhelm individual defenders. The healer's peaceful settlement was being systematically destroyed, its gardens trampled and buildings reduced to rubble. It was during the height of the battle that Emperor Krayt himself descended from his flagship. His arrival was preceded by a wave of dark side energy, so intense that it made the planet's wildlife flee in terror. Ancient trees withered at his approach, and the very air seemed to grow thick with malevolent power. He had changed since Talon last saw him. The Yuzhen Vong implants that had been slowly killing him for decades were more prominent now, creating coral growths that pulsed with alien rhythms. His cybernetic enhancements had been upgraded as well, replacing failing organic systems with technology that allowed his consciousness to persist despite his body's deterioration. "My wayward hand," he said, as the fighting paused around them. His voice carried across the battlefield, with unnatural clarity, enhanced by force techniques that made every word feel like a physical blow. "You have caused considerable inconvenience with your rebellion, but I am prepared to offer redemption if you return to my service willingly." "I've seen what your service costs," Talon replied, her lightsabers held ready. "The plague weapons, the forced transformations, the systematic elimination of anyone who questions your vision. I won't be part of that anymore." Krait's laughter was like breaking glass mixed with dying screams. "You think you have found freedom, but you have simply exchanged one form of servitude for another. The light side is as limiting as the dark, demanding sacrifice of personal power in service of others' weakness. True strength comes from transcending such arbitrary limitations." What followed was not just a lightsaber duel, but a battle between competing philosophies made manifest through force combat. Krait fought with the accumulated knowledge of over a century of Sith mastery, his techniques drawing power from the suffering of countless victims. His attacks seemed to bend reality itself, creating spaces where normal physical laws ceased to apply. But Talon had learned to access different sources of strength during her time with the healers. Her power flowed not from rage or hatred but from determination to protect beings who had shown her kindness. The tattoos that had once channeled only dark side energy now served as conduits for something more complex, drawing from both light and shadow in ways that traditional Sith training had never explored. The duel raged across the devastated settlement, two figures moving at speeds that made them blur to ordinary perception. Where their blades met, the air itself caught fire and the ground beneath their feet cracked from the forces they unleashed. Buildings collapsed from the sheer pressure of their conflict, while those force-sensitive enough to perceive the battle's true nature watched in awe and terror. It was Cade who ultimately decided the battle's outcome, as Krait pressed his advantage through superior experience and raw power. The young Skywalker made a choice that would define the rest of his life. He reached out through the Force not to heal but to harm, using his unique abilities to disrupt the delicate balance of organic and cybernetic systems that kept the ancient Sith Emperor alive. The effect was immediate and devastating. Krait's coordination faltered as his life support systems began to fail, giving Talon the opening she needed to strike a decisive blow. Her lightsaber found its mark through gaps in his defenses, but even as he fell, his expression showed no surprise or regret. "You think this ends anything?" he gasped, his voice now carrying the mechanical rasp of failing systems. "But I am not the disease. I am merely its most visible symptom. The one Sith will continue without me, and the galaxy will burn until someone with the strength to rule it properly emerges from the ashes." With those words, the most powerful Sith Lord of his generation died on a world dedicated to healing, his body finally succumbing to decades of damage. But even in death, his presence seemed to linger, as though his hatred had become so intense that it could survive the destruction of its physical vessel. As the surviving Imperial forces retreated in disarray, Talon stood over her former master's body, and wondered if this victory had solved anything, or simply created new problems she couldn't yet comprehend. The aftermath of Krait's death sent shockwaves throughout the galaxy that reached far beyond the remote world where he had fallen. Across the Empire, Sith Lords who had served as his hands suddenly found themselves without clear leadership. while Imperial military commanders struggled to maintain order without the unifying presence that had held the one Sith together. Talon felt the Emperor's death through the Force in ways that went beyond mere awareness. The tattoos covering her skin, which had been connected to his power through Sith alchemy, began to change as the energy that had sustained them for years suddenly shifted. The dark side pathways carved into her flesh remained functional, but they no longer carried the overwhelming compulsion toward absolute obedience that had defined her existence as a hand. "It's like waking up from a dream I didn't know I was having," she told Cade, as they helped the healers assess damage to their settlement. "I can feel the difference in everything from how I think to how I move. The power is still there, but it doesn't feel like it's controlling me anymore." Elder Senna examined Talon's tattoos with the careful attention of someone who understood the deeper implications of what had occurred. The patterns remain unchanged, but the energy flowing through them has become more balanced. Krait's death severed connections that were binding you to his will in ways you probably never fully realized. The observation was both liberating and terrifying. How many of her thoughts and decisions over the years had truly been her own, and how many had been influenced by subtle compulsions woven into the very modifications that gave her power? The question raised disturbing possibilities about the nature of identity and free will that would take time to fully process. But there were more immediate concerns, demanding attention. Reports, filtering in from across the galaxy, suggested that Krait's death had triggered chaos rather than peace. Without his iron control holding them together, various Sith factions were beginning to fight among themselves for supremacy. Imperial military units were defecting or declaring independence, while planets that had been forcibly pacified began to revolt. "The Empire is coming apart," Cade said as they monitored intelligence reports in the Healer's Communication Center. "Some systems are celebrating, but others are facing complete breakdown of civil order." Krait might have been a tyrant, but he was also the only thing preventing total anarchy. The irony wasn't lost on either of them. They had struck a blow for freedom by eliminating a dictator, but the immediate result was suffering for millions of beings caught in the chaos that followed. It was a reminder that complex problems rarely had simple solutions, and that even necessary actions could have unintended consequences. Over the following weeks, they worked with the healers to establish communication networks between worlds, seeking alternatives to both imperial tyranny and anarchic collapse. The goal wasn't to create another centralized government, but to facilitate cooperation between systems that shared common values about individual freedom and collective responsibility. The work was slow and often frustrating. Decades of imperial conditioning had left many beings unable to imagine functioning without external authority telling them what to do. Others had been so traumatized by Sith rule that they viewed any form of organization with suspicion. Building trust between former enemies required patience and wisdom that sometimes seemed beyond their capabilities. "I keep thinking about what Krait said before he died," Talon admitted during one of their evening conversations, about being a symptom rather than the disease itself. What if eliminating him wasn't really solving the problem, but just removing the most obvious manifestation of it? "Then we deal with whatever comes next," Cade replied with pragmatic determination. "The galaxy has problems that go back thousands of years, cycles of conflict between light and dark that seem to repeat endlessly. We can't solve everything, but we can try to make things better than they were." His words reminded her of conversations with ancient Sith spirits who had wrestled with similar questions about the relationship between individual actions and historical forces. Perhaps the goal wasn't to achieve perfect solutions, but to make choices that honored the values they had discovered during their journey together. As months passed, the immediate crisis began to stabilize into something resembling a new normal. The Galactic Federation Triumvirate, led by beings like Admiral Gar Stasi and Empress Marasiah Fel, emerged as a coalition government committed to rebuilding institutions based on consent rather than coercion. It wasn't perfect, and many challenges remained, but it represented progress toward the kind of society worth fighting to protect. Talon found herself taking on roles she had never imagined during her years as a Sith hand. Instead of hunting enemies for elimination, she worked to identify Force-sensitive individuals who needed protection from remnant Sith factions. Rather than enforcing Imperial decrees through violence, she helped mediate disputes between communities learning to govern themselves. The tattooed patterns covering her skin had become symbols of transformation rather than domination. Other former Sith, inspired by her example, began seeking ways to redirect their abilities toward constructive purposes. It was dangerous work, since many Imperial loyalists viewed them as traitors deserving death, but it offered the possibility of redemption for beings who had been shaped by systems beyond their control. "Do you ever regret the choices we made?" Cade asked during one of their missions to a world still recovering from Sith occupation. "I regret the time it took me to make them," she replied. "Honestly, all the suffering I caused before I understood there were alternatives. But not the choices themselves. For the first time in my life, I feel like I'm becoming who I was meant to be, rather than what someone else needed me to be." The conversation took place as they watched children playing in a settlement that had been rebuilt after Imperial forces destroyed it years earlier. The children included multiple species working together without the prejudices that had been systematically encouraged under Sith rule. Their laughter carried hope for futures that might be different from the past. As the twin suns of that distant world set behind mountains that had once hidden resistance fighters from Imperial patrols, Talon reflected on the long journey that had brought her to this moment. She had begun as a slave child whose only choice was between submission and death. She had become a weapon designed to enforce another being's vision of order through violence. But now she was something new, something that hadn't existed before in galactic history. She was proof that even the most thorough conditioning could be overcome, that beings shaped by trauma could choose healing over revenge. That power could serve protection rather than domination. The tattoos beneath her clothing pulsed with energy that felt clean and purposeful, no longer tainted by compulsions she hadn't chosen. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she would face them as herself rather than as someone else's creation. 3 years had passed since Krait's death, and the galaxy was slowly finding its new equilibrium. The process hadn't been smooth or painless. Entire sectors had endured civil wars as former Imperial territories fought to determine their own futures. Refugee populations numbered in the billions, displaced beings seeking safety from conflicts that seemed to spring up as quickly as others were resolved. Talon had established herself on Ryloth, the world of her birth, though she bore little resemblance to the frightened child who had been taken from slave markets decades earlier. The planet's new government had specifically requested her help in rebuilding institutions that could protect Twi'lek interests without repeating the cycles of exploitation that had defined their history for millennia. "It's strange being back here," she told Cade, during one of his visits to the reconstruction efforts. "Every street, every building carries memories of what I lost when the slavers took me, but also what I might have become if none of this had happened." The work on Ryloth was particularly meaningful because it addressed root causes rather than just symptoms of galactic instability. The planet's location at major hyperspace crossroads had made it valuable to various powers throughout history, but that strategic importance had consistently translated into suffering for its native population. Breaking those patterns required fundamental changes in how galactic commerce and politics functioned. Talon's approach to these challenges drew on everything she had learned during her transformation from Sith weapon to independent agent. Her knowledge of Imperial administrative systems helped identify corruption and inefficiency. Her understanding of force dynamics allowed her to sense deception and hidden agendas during negotiations. Most importantly, Her personal experience with systematic oppression gave her credibility with populations who had learned to distrust authority figures. "The tattoos help in unexpected ways," she explained to a group of planetary leaders who had questioned whether a former Sith could truly represent their interests. "People see them and know immediately that I understand what it means to be shaped by forces beyond your control. They also know that I chose to use my power differently once I had the freedom to make that choice." The patterns covering her skin had indeed become symbols that transcended their original purpose. Former Imperial citizens who encountered her often experienced cognitive dissonance that forced them to reconsider assumptions about Sith nature and the possibility of redemption. Her very existence challenged narratives that painted the galaxy's conflicts in terms of absolute good and evil. But the work was far from easy. Remnant Sith factions continued to operate throughout the galaxy, some seeking to restore Imperial rule while others pursued personal agendas of revenge and acquisition. These groups viewed former Sith like Talon as particular threats, since their existence proved that the conditioning methods used to create perfect servants were not as permanent as originally believed. The most persistent threat came from Darth Wirelock, the Chagrian Sith Lord, who had survived Krait's death and managed to rally significant portions of the Imperial military to his cause. Unlike his predecessor, Wirelock was patient and methodical, building power bases carefully rather than attempting dramatic conquest campaigns that would attract coordinated opposition. "He knows me too well," Talon admitted. During a strategy session with New Republic intelligence analysts, "We trained together for years at the Academy. He understands my capabilities and limitations better than almost anyone alive. That makes him uniquely dangerous as an opponent." The psychological dimension of their conflict was particularly challenging. Wirelock represented everything she had been trained to become, a perfect embodiment of Sith principles who viewed her transformation as both betrayal and weakness. His propaganda efforts portrayed her as a failed experiment whose apparent redemption was actually evidence of fundamental character flaws that had made her unsuitable for true power. "He's not entirely wrong," she reflected. During private conversations with Elder Senna, who had become something approaching a mentor during the years since Krait's defeat, there were aspects of traditional Sith training that I never fully embraced. The casual cruelty, the complete disregard for beings viewed as inferior, the willingness to sacrifice anything for personal advancement. Maybe those failures made my eventual transformation possible. Or perhaps they were signs of strength rather than weakness, Senna suggested gently. "It takes tremendous courage to resist conditioning designed to eliminate empathy and compassion. The fact that you retained enough humanity to eventually choose differently might be your greatest achievement." The conversation took place in gardens that had been restored after the Imperial assault years earlier. New growth surrounded memorials to beings who had died defending their peaceful way of life, creating spaces where beauty and remembrance coexisted. The setting reinforced Senna's point about the possibility of creating something positive from experiences of loss and trauma. As the years passed, Talon found herself taking on increasingly complex responsibilities that went far beyond her original focus on Ryloth's reconstruction. The New Republic had recognized her unique qualifications for dealing with Force-related threats, and she was often called upon to investigate situations involving rogue Sith, corrupted Jedi artifacts, or populations affected by Imperial biological weapons. Each mission reinforced lessons about the interconnected nature of galactic problems and the importance of addressing underlying causes rather than just immediate symptoms. A planet suffering from Sith-engineered plagues required not just medical treatment, but also social structures that could prevent similar bioweapons from being deployed in the future. Former Imperial officials seeking redemption needed guidance that acknowledged both their crimes and their potential for positive change. "I never expected to become a teacher," she told Cade during one of their regular communication sessions. But that's what this work really involves. Helping beings understand that they have choices they didn't know existed, that the roles they were assigned don't have to define who they become. The irony of her position wasn't lost on either of them. Someone who had been created as the ultimate Sith weapon was now dedicated to helping others discover alternatives to violence and domination. Her tattoos, originally designed to channel dark side energy for destructive purposes, had become tools for healing trauma and building connections between former enemies. As she stood in her office overlooking Ryloth's capital city, watching the controlled chaos of beings from dozens of species working together to build something better than what had existed before, Talon reflected on the long journey that had brought her to this moment. The frightened slave child, the perfect Sith weapon, the conflicted agent of change, all of these identities had been necessary steps in becoming someone who could serve purposes larger than personal ambition. The work was far from finished, and new challenges emerged constantly. But for the first time in her life, she felt genuinely hopeful about the galaxy's future. 10 years had passed since the fall of Emperor Crate, and the galaxy had found a rhythm that resembled peace more than anything witnessed in living memory. The great conflicts that had defined generations were becoming historical footnotes, replaced by the quieter but no less important work of building societies that could sustain themselves without constant warfare. Talon stood in the meditation chamber she had carved from living rock on Ryloth's highest peak, watching the twin suns set over landscapes that had been transformed by a decade of careful restoration. The caverns below housed refugees from dozens of worlds, beings who had found sanctuary in the same mountains where she had played as a child before the slavers changed everything. Her reflection in the polished stone walls showed a being who had aged with grace and purpose. The tattoos covering her skin had evolved over the years, not in their physical appearance, but in their spiritual resonance. Where once they had channeled pure dark side energy focused on domination and destruction, now they served as conduits for something more complex and ultimately more powerful. The same patterns that had made her into Krait's perfect weapon now helped her heal trauma and build bridges between former enemies. The children ask about you constantly. Elder Senna's voice carried from the chamber entrance. The aging healer had become a regular visitor to Ryloth, helping establish training programs for Force-sensitive refugees who needed guidance that went beyond traditional Jedi or Sith methods. "What do they want to know?" Talon asked without turning from the window. Below them, the settlement's lights were beginning to twinkle as families gathered for evening meals and community activities that had been impossible during the years of Imperial occupation. "They want to understand how someone can change so completely while remaining fundamentally themselves," Senna replied, settling into the meditation posture that had become natural during their years of working together. How the same person who once served as an instrument of oppression could become a symbol of hope for beings seeking their own transformation. The question touched on mysteries that Talon was still exploring after all these years. The process of change had been neither linear nor complete. She still carried the capacity for violence that had made her effective as a Sith hand, still felt the pull of anger and hatred when confronted with injustice. But she had learned to channel those impulses differently, using them as fuel for protecting rather than conquering. "I tell them that identity isn't fixed," she said, finally. "That we're all composed of different aspects that can be emphasized or suppressed depending on our choices. The darkness is still part of me, but so is the light I discovered with Cade and the healers. The tattoos help me access both, depending on what each situation requires." As if summoned by her words, a communication device in the chamber chimed softly with an incoming message. Cade's image materialized in holographic form, older now but still carrying the restless energy that had defined him during their first meeting in that Tatooine cantina years earlier. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important," he said with the easy smile that had become more frequent as the galaxy's wounds slowly healed. "But I wanted to share some news. The Senate has approved funding for the Force Sensitivity Support Network we proposed. Starting next year, we'll have resources to help beings across the galaxy who are struggling with abilities they don't understand." The news represented years of careful political work, building coalitions between former enemies who had learned to trust each other through shared experiences of loss and rebuilding. The network would provide alternatives to the traditional binary choice between Jedi and Sith training, offering paths that acknowledge the complexity of Force sensitivity without demanding absolute allegiance to specific philosophies. "That's wonderful," Talon replied, and meant it. "How many systems have committed to participation?" "Over 300 so far, with more joining every week," Cade reported. The Twi'lek delegation was particularly influential in convincing others. When they described the work you've been doing on Ryloth, it provided a concrete example of what becomes possible when Force users focus on healing rather than conquest. After the communication ended, Talon and Senna sat in comfortable silence as full darkness settled over the mountains. The night sky was brilliant, with stars that had once seemed impossibly distant. But hyperspace travel and galactic communication networks had made them feel like neighboring communities. The isolation that had once protected vulnerable populations had given way to connections that allowed mutual support and shared prosperity. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you had made different choices along the way?" Senna asked during their evening meditation. "Every day," Talon admitted, "but I've learned to think of those alternative possibilities as gifts rather than regrets. Each path not taken reminds me that choice is always available, even when circumstances make it seem impossible." The slave child, the Sith weapon, the reformed agent, they were all necessary steps in becoming someone who could serve purposes larger than personal survival. The meditation chamber's acoustics carried sounds from the settlement below, laughter and conversation that spoke of communities learning to trust each other across species and cultural boundaries. Children who had been born into war were growing up in an environment where cooperation was normal rather than exceptional, where difference was celebrated rather than feared. Through the Force, Talon could sense similar transformations occurring throughout the galaxy. Former Imperial worlds were establishing democratic institutions that included representation for previously oppressed populations. Jedi survivors were emerging from hiding to share knowledge that had been preserved through the darkest years. Even some former Sith were finding ways to redirect their abilities toward constructive purposes, inspired by examples of redemption that had once seemed impossible. The tattoos beneath her robes pulsed with energy that felt clean and purposeful, connected to the natural rhythms of life rather than the artificial constructs of political power. Each symbol had been earned through suffering, but that suffering had been transformed into wisdom that could benefit others facing similar challenges. As the night deepened, Talon prepared for sleep in chambers that felt more like home than anywhere she had lived since childhood. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. Communications from worlds seeking guidance with Force-related problems. Meetings with political leaders working to maintain the fragile peace that had emerged from chaos. But tonight, surrounded by the quiet sounds of a community at rest, she felt something she had never expected to experience again. Contentment, not the brittle satisfaction of victory over enemies, but the deeper peace that came from knowing her power served purposes worthy of the sacrifices required to claim it. The galaxy would continue to face challenges that tested the bonds between beings who had once viewed each other as natural enemies. New conflicts would emerge as old ones faded, requiring constant vigilance and adaptation from those committed to preserving the hard-won peace. But the foundations were strong now, built on understanding rather than fear, cooperation rather than domination. Whatever darkness might emerge in the future would find a galaxy better prepared to resist it, guided by beings who had learned that true strength came through connection rather than isolation. In her dreams that night, Talon saw children playing in gardens that had once been battlefields, their laughter echoing across worlds, where the ancient cycle of conflict had finally been broken. The tattoos that told the story of her transformation glowed softly in the starlight, living proof that even the deepest wounds could become sources of wisdom and strength. The whisper that had once been lost in time had grown into a chorus of voices, choosing hope over despair, healing over vengeance, tomorrow over yesterday. And in that chorus, the song of Darth Talon's transformation would echo through the generations, inspiring others to discover their own paths from darkness into light.